My name is Catalina Maria Johnson, and I was trained as a linguist, but I moved into music. But I'm fascinated by everything that is at the crossroads of language and music and identity and culture, and especially immigrant gifts to this land. I hope you visit my radio show, Beat Latino, which listen to it online at beatlatino.com after it airs on Vocalo, Chicago Public Media, Sundays at 11. And it's a treat to have a chance to organize our thoughts around such an interesting and important and timely topic. So thank you to the Wheaton Public Library and the Community Relations Commission and the Women League of Voters and Wheaton. And it's a treat to be here. I'm going to pass it on to, I believe, Mario.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Mario Fernandez. I am, you want to introduce myself as an immigrant from Honduras. I came to the United States as a 2-year-old. So I am a first generation Latino American, and I grew up in DuPage County. I grew up in Addison, not too far here from Wheaton. Currently, I've been working in education for 18 years. Part of my work in education has been in, curriculum and instruction, some educational leadership, and currently in the school counseling role. Some of a lot of the work that I've done with students throughout my career has been with, diverse populations, minoritized students, and it's really where I feel a calling to serve our community and my community. I was a classroom teacher for 14 years, and the last 5 years I've been serving as a school counselor. And being a school counselor, you get to I've been able to experience a variety of different roles where I've worked with in equity and diversity and inclusion. Currently, I'm serving as an instructional coach for teachers and other staff members, where along with my responsibilities as a school counselor, where I can provide a lens, support, and a lens and support for lessons and work that we're doing around the building that is surrounded around diversity, equity, and inclusion for our students. I also work as an adjunct professor at Concordia University, and I teach school counseling there. And part of my role has been to mentor interns that are finishing up their school counseling degree, and part of that I feel is important is I also teach a multicultural counseling class, and I feel that that's a calling of mine to help the school counselors going into the field now and be able to address the needs of diverse populations in our area. And lastly, I am a Wheaton resident now, so this is an honor to be here and serve my community in this manner. And my wife is also an educator. She's a Spanish teacher. I have 2 kids, 3 and 7, and one of my kids is in a dual language program. And she came home not too long ago and talking about how Papi, I'm Hispanic, and I never heard her say anything like that. And it was just interesting that we're having this panel today and talking about those terms and what does that mean to my 7-year-old right now, and what is she learning, and how do we unpack that and process that in our own home. So thank you for having me, and sorry for being a little long-winded there, but thank you. And I think Dr. Pollo, you next.
Thank you, Mario. My name is Limaris Puello, and I currently serve as the Director of Multilingual Learners and Equity. Multilingual Learners and Equity with Wheaton Warrenville District 200. I am currently a resident of Carroll Stream. I was originally born in Puerto Rico. I grew up in Chicago, and my teaching experience was in Chicago Public Schools. And then I moved towards to the Glenbard Schools, where I worked as an administrator there for 8 years. I've been in my current role for about 3 years. And one of the things that I really enjoy about working in this role is that, so for me, English is not my first language. When I initially enrolled in school, I was in a bilingual program. And so being able to be the director of a program that is supporting, families that are acquiring language, and just being able to connect with families, it just gives me that sense of being able to give back to a community. I feel connected with the families, and my goals are really to ensure that all of our students have access to an equitable education, making sure that we're able to break down barriers for families, and making sure that they can see that there are no limits to what our students can become. And so just really being an advocate for our students, family, and community members that are students that are from minoritized populations, just being able to support them.
I think it's Neil's turn.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. My name is Neil Cruz. I am currently a social studies teacher at Glenbar North High School in Carroll Stream. My story actually begins in my teaching history begins more so in the city, where I could say the first half of my career really took off, and had the opportunity to work in several schools, primarily in the north side of the city, including Aspida. After Aspida, a short time also at Perspectives Charter School in the South Loop, Association House in Humboldt Park, Rudy Lozano Leadership Academy in Pilsen as well. And each of those opportunities really kind of brought me to work with with students, focusing on culture, focusing on bringing social studies more alive within the classroom. And my career at Glenbar North started in 2013. So the ability to kind of have the experience for my career to begin in the city, transition to Glenbar North, in 2013. It's been an amazing journey, to say the least. I think one of the most important things that one of the good experiences that's come out of Glenbar North, aside from from the classes, the interactions with colleagues, students on a daily basis, I think is the opportunity and the willingness of our department to really to give the support to develop a Latin American history class. And I think in correlation with the activity that we're doing today, the ability to be able to educate, the ability to be able to talk about terminology, the ability to be able to share history, is something that I think has been an invaluable opportunity. And the fact that we got to do it at Glenbar North for many students who for quite some time had been asking for more courses, who had been asking to kind of hear their history spoken about in class, to have more of the background of Mexican history, Puerto Rican history, just Latin American history in general. It's been a great opportunity overall to take part in. So while I do teach at Carroll Stream, I live in the city, still on the north side in Belmont Gardens. Maybe make the long commute every day back and forth, but honestly, I wouldn't give it up for anything. It's been a great opportunity, and happy to be sharing this time with everyone too.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to unpack, as Mario said, the terms a bit and our experiences, and come up. Let me just say, if anybody's expecting any answers, at least not from me, any kind of definitive, this is what you need to do in every situation, you will know what to do, you will know what to say, you will know what to call yourself, you will know what to call others. Well, it's not happening. It is not happening. It's not happening here. It's a lifelong, if not the life of a people's and several people's long journey. This is who I am. My mother's from Mexico, San Luis Potosí, and was here most of her life with my father, the Johnson, who's Swedish and German. So it's a little hard for me to, it's a Mexican, Swedish, German, American, but our culture was bilingual. We didn't use identity terms in my house unless it was bicultural. It was like bicultural, it's Mexico and the United States and Mexico. You're bicultural, you're bilingual. They were academics. And thanks to them, I'm here today. And I appreciate, and I'm grateful for that. So with that, I will stop sharing. This is our panel, and I'm very excited to hear our panelists' thoughts on the terms they've used, maybe, or their families used, or how their thinking's changed over time. And I know Mario talked about unpacking. What kinds of things, what kinds of thoughts come to mind? What kinds of impressions come to mind when you think of unpacking these terms for your students? What kind of suggestions might we have, if you have some? Just a sharing of thoughts.
So if I may address some of that briefly, I know I alluded to, my own daughter coming home from her dual language program, saying, I'm Hispanic, and it came to me as I was proud, but I also was kind of shocked, because like we don't really talk about labels in our home. My wife is Italian American, and we often do talk about being bicultural in a variety of different ways. And like I said, I know that was something that when she said it, I was proud. She said it to my parents not too long ago, and I as I've been thinking about that, I'm just like, this is a term, Hispanic, whether you like it or not. My own child didn't have a choice in her classroom of, at least the way I interpreted, of like what she wants to call herself or how she wants to identify. And I think that is often something that we run into in schools is, we label students intentionally or unintentionally, because I think it makes people in positions of power more comfortable to be able to categorize and put students in groups, by saying these are Latinx or Latino or Hispanic or African American, whatever term you want to use. But back to the root of it, it's like I want to be able, as a parent, to be able to identify and define that term with my own daughter, and I think that goes way back to even us as panelists, and I don't want to speak for Dr. Puello or Mr. Cruz here, but as children in the American educational system, and I still see it in schools I work in, and the way that our names are pronounced, in schools, and they've been Americanized, and our own children have been given different names and last names pronounced differently because somebody didn't take the time to want to learn how to actually pronounce it. And I think that this is a conversation that is could be tangential to this, but still is relevant in regards to wanting to label or call people something that makes you feel comfortable, not what makes them comfortable. And with that, um, I think about our own community, and our own community, I mean like the Latino Hispanic population, however you want to, whatever term that you feel comfortable using to identify yourself, that there are so many terms to identify because we are such a diverse community, and that's one thing that I've really tried to teach my students when I taught Latin American studies in my classroom, was that Latinos, Hispanics, Afro-Latinos, like we are so diverse that there's not going to be one term that defines us. I think of my own country of Honduras, like we have a large population that is of African descent, a large part of our population that doesn't even speak Spanish. They're from, Garifuna backgrounds, from the Mosquita Coast, just a lot of indigenous roots too, and African roots, and they're not Hispanic, and they tend to identify differently too. And you get a lot of Afro Latinos in the United States that are categorized as African American, and they don't even speak English, and they're not of African American descent. And I think that's an important point here, to understand that our community, the Latino community, is very, very diverse, and I feel very comfortable, and I haven't always felt this way, that our community should be able to identify and call themselves whatever they feel comfortable with, and who am I, or who are our schools or people in positions of power to tell us how we should identify, you know. And I think it's fluid. I think it's okay to change your mind. How you identify, and I'll tell you this, like I grew up in the United States in the early 80s, and now that I watch those commercials about the census, I think about like, wow, my parents always have used the word Hispanos and Latinos for us, and why. And if I threw it to my parents like, hey, we're Latinx, they'd be like, yes, eso, like, what is that? And somebody put in the chat about is there a generational or maybe even an educational reason why people refer or use varying terms, and I think there might be some truth to that. You know, um, I don't know what the answer is to that though. So thank
Well,
you.
no, thank you for those. That's just really interesting, because two things that I think are important about that is one is who's using the term in what setting. So if you are the other, if you are not in the group, Hispanic, Latino, Latine, Latinx, you don't get to choose. The power is not yours to define or decide. The other is that it's an umbrella term. It's called umbrella for a reason. If you are dealing with, if you are in La Villita, chances are very good that most of the in people that you would want to address would be of Mexican background. I mean, and so if you have groups of Mexican citizens or of a Mexican descent or Mexican Americans, then don't use, you might not need to use an umbrella term. And it might be kind of ridiculous to use one, because an umbrella term is precisely umbrella to encompass more. But who defines the umbrella term is very important. And I think it really has to be a self-definition. And that will change. And that's too bad. You have to figure it, you might have to figure out for every person or every group of people you address, if you are the other. And you'll have to figure out how to pronounce all those names. Guess what? So I think you made some very wonderful points. I'd love to hear some other thoughts, Dr. Puello, Mr. Cruz.
Yeah, I just really wanted to add on what you were saying, just about, like, obviously the terms being umbrella terms. I just really want to point out, or just really stress, that when we're talking about like the Latino, Latin, Latinx community, we're talking about a lot of individuals that, they do, for the most part, share a common language, but there are a lot of other cultural differences that make up this community. And so, I mean, grouping the individuals together, but it's also just being cognizant of the fact that you have a lot of different groups with different traditions, different customs, and that those are things that the individuals are really proud of, things that they value. And I think that sometimes there's just this, when you think of Latino, you kind of have this perception without realizing that there's so many distinct and different cultural variations and differences. And even with the shared language is different across those different countries and places and regions. And so the way we communicate is also different. We use different words. And those are all really important things, just to point out that we're all different. And there's this term that unites us, which is great, but we all do have our differences that do separate us and that we value.
Hi, Neil, you have Mr. Cruz.
Yeah.
Whatever you prefer.
Así está bien.
Así está bien.
No, so thank you. And just to kind of go along with Dr. Puello and with Mario as well, there's, for me, like that, there's another level as well too, because I think there's the challenges that sometimes we face kind of within our own communities. There's the challenge we face outwardly with all the communities that we interact with in a city like Chicago, in the suburbs. There's the challenges we sometimes face within our own communities as we kind of like seek acceptance as well too, as we're growing up. I think about high school, going to high school here. I went to high school at St. Joseph in Westchester. So for those of you who are familiar, like the school that they filmed Hoop Dreams, it's now closed and everything. So it's crazy, like when your high school is no longer open anymore. You kind of see, like, you just see this old shell of a building where you once went to. And it's and it was challenging because it's like you growing up in Puerto Rico, like you begin to have an identity. You start to realize that there's certain things, there's cultural traditions. You go to the store, you learn how to speak Spanish, you interact with people, you have all these interactions during the course of the day. You move to the US, and then it's always like, well, you're not Puerto Rican. You don't look Puerto Rican. And we fight that battle sometimes within our own communities. Okay, well, what am I supposed to necessarily look like? What does, like, is there like a certain like look? Is there a certain mold that I'm supposed to fit? And then it always comes down to like, and then once you speak Spanish, like, oh my God, oh, like you talk like just how they do from the island and stuff. It's just like, well, yeah, I mean, if you just would have asked the question earlier, I mean, we could have gotten over this as well. So I think like, there's the challenges we kind of face within as we kind of try to seek, as we try to seek identity. My dad, growing up in New York, in the 60s and 70s, talks about how maybe it's an experience that we just didn't have here in Chicago. You compare Chicago to New York, and he talks about his neighborhood and like the transitions that kind of happened in the neighborhoods, especially during the 60s and the 70s. Sometimes terms were just like Spanish were used. Like Spanish was used as a term to kind of identify Puerto Ricans, and then later Dominicans began to come in the 80s as well. You had established Cuban communities as well there. So in the past, like he grew up with the term Spanish, and then it was always the Puerto Ricans as well. So then the term became kind of where you were from, so specifically as well. And I think that's kind of one of the challenges that I face, kind of, growing up in the island, moving here, and then going to college, where you kind of face like the same challenges again, where it almost seems like sometimes you're in competition with like the students who are just like really, really just kind of like academically sound, and just like they're part of organizations, they're part of, all the student groups and everything. And sometimes you're just like, wow, like, I mean, you have like this really like, you have like the sense of identity which you've gone and created, and you're just like, wow, like I'm not speaking as, as astutely as you might be. I'm not, like, do I truly understand my day? So college is a complete other, is a complete other beast as we kind of begin to figure out, our identity. But I think like in schools, what I have noticed, and there's a big difference, having taught in the city, where there was never a a doubt as to just like you were who you were. The students knew where I was from. I felt comfortable in class speaking Spanish, and sometimes in class I would go back and forth between Spanish and class, and it wasn't a big deal. And even though the classes you had, not just like you just didn't have students of a Latin American background, but you had students from different areas. We engaged about things, we talked about things. The African-American students who may have grown up in Humboldt Park had knowledge of the stuff that the Puerto Rican kids knew, as well, that the Mexican, the students knew as well. And there was always that interchange of stuff. There was conversation, it was fluid. But then teaching in DuPage was kind of an eye-opener for a couple of reasons. And there's one story that I'll mention. I remember my first year, you kind of said you start your first year in a new school and you're cautious. You're learning the ropes. You're trying to figure, out who's, like you're understanding the ropes, I guess is the best way to say it. And I know there was a student in a U.S. history class, and on the roster, her name was Mireya Bedoya. And I just like, okay, it's Mireya Bedoya. And, and I would call the name and I would just say Mireya, Mireya. And I remember one day I was asking her, I was walking around, and this was probably about 3 weeks in, and then she's like, Mr. Cruz, it's not Mireya, it's Mireya. And I'm like, oh. And I wasn't confronted with that before, because it's like, for me, it was like, I would see a name in Spanish and I would just like, immediately, I would just be like, I would just connect with it because it's what I had connected with before. But this student obviously wanted some sort of a disconnection as well, or there was, and maybe it was something within the past, something I didn't understand, but it was just, the look was just like, please don't call me that again. And it was just like, wow. I'm like, okay, this is a different place. And, and in creating the Latin American history class, I think the one thing that we've kind of learned is that there's a lot of students, and sometimes we may take for granted, if we're living in the city, if our upbringing is more in an urban area, and we've had the good fortune to have had, teachers in high school, great professors, in college, wherever you went to, individuals who are very passionate or very involved in community organizing, or kind of seeing the development of the community from, through all its generations. And it's interesting because like a lot of students don't have that much of a background about their history. So you're building that first. you can identify the stuff that they really, really, truly enjoy. And those things kind of rotate around music and sport. But then the identity issue can be a little, it could be an area like as you begin to step into it, you might begin to realize that based on who their friends are, they may be less likely to want to engage in Spanish. They may be a little bit more self-conscious when you say their name properly, as well too, because it draws attention to them. Sometimes when topics are also brought up, within the classroom, there's always the fear that someone else in the classroom may, have something to say to the contrary of that, especially if you go anywhere towards the topics of immigration or anything personal, which the students may have gone to. So I think all those things kind of play a big role in, I think, as educators, as we try to support students through this and kind of guide them through this to, have these questions, because there's so many different layers that as you begin to talk about it, sometimes students can kind of tend to not want to engage out of fear of what they might hear other their peers or based on their past experiences.
If I could jump in briefly to just comment on something that Neil was saying, but I've been teaching in DuPage County, grew up in DuPage County my entire life, and in the school I work in, it's predominantly students of Latin American descent, a lot of Spanish speaking students, about 67%, and I have similar experiences as you, Neil, in the classroom where I see names of students and I always pronounce them, in the way I would pronounce them at home, like how my parents, would pronounce the name, or in Spanish. And it's interesting because I've had that experience where kids would say, well, it's this or it's that. And I'm just like, well, why is it that? Because when you were born, I guarantee you your Spanish speaking parents didn't call you that. And we start getting into this conversation of like, who gave you that Americanized name? And I started thinking back to, especially now that I have a 7-year-old, like, okay, so if somebody mispronounces the name of a, Latino Hispanic student at 7 years old, you're looking up to your teacher, a person that's teaching you that as a role model. Like, are you going to correct them in that classroom? No, absolutely not. Especially if you're an immigrant child who's coming into a new culture, you don't know anything, you don't know anybody, and you're really going to correct your teacher? That's just not in our culture that you're going to do that to your teacher. And from that beginning, your name has been changed by somebody else. And that's just a microcosm of, in my opinion, what happens to a variety of different minoritized communities, and I think it's important that we give students the information as to why we use the terms Latinx, Latine, Latin with an arroba, Hispanic, and let them choose how they want to identify. And I think now that I'm a 40-year-old man, hopefully more mature in my life, I've made some decisions as to how I identify, how I pronounce my name even. For my entire life, I was Mario Fernandez. And only recently do I introduce myself as, I still say Mario oftentimes, but more often do I hear myself just naturally saying, my name is Mario Fernandez. That's always been my name and the places that have mattered to me, and if that was my given name, and I think that we have to give the power back to the people that have names, let them call themselves what they want, not what you want to call them, because it makes you feel more comfortable. And I think all it takes is just asking a question.
And being open to, to whatever possibility is given to you. This is just fascinating. It's such an interesting discussion to me on so many levels, but that was reminding me of, at a time I did for some time a while back, I did the Latin music show for WBZ. Now I do one for that airs on Vocalo, but I've always pronounced my name, Catalina Maria Johnson. My name is Catalina Maria Johnson. You just kind of like deal with the Catalina Maria and then do the Johnson. And when I was introduced by hosts, there was a big discussion at some point at WBZ, but whether they needed to say Catalina Maria or something approximating that, or Catalina Maria, So I find that fascinating. The way that this has been such an interesting tie-in, not just the umbrella term or the general label. And context is so important, because in Mexico, you don't really worry about, you are who you are, and you identify by nation, by, Mexican, right? But it's what happens when you are in a different context, when you are here, and you also have, again, I think somebody asked, I know we're going to get to the questions at the end, but somebody asked about umbrella terms. Why an umbrella term? Because you're here and you have more in common on some level with certain folks than others. And it's a strong commonality and a strong bond, even though it's not based on your nation. It's based on a series of other factors. But that I think that's so important with young people with anybody, to ask the question, but with young people to say that these are the options. These are the options as of now. There will be more in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. There'll be more. There'll be something entirely different. Everybody who gets a little upset about Latinx, or a lot upset at this point, there'll be something else. Trust me, nothing is forever. Just like Hispanic has to some extent fallen out of favor, and the bureaucracy and the politics and the marketing that created it in a way in this country have become more visible and uncomfortable to some, but not to others. And that's okay. If that is what you prefer, if that is the aspect of your reality that you as an individual, or you with your family, or you with your Chamber of Commerce or your church, if that is what you want to emphasize, that aspect of your history and background and legacy, that's okay. It is not up to me to say, do not use that. You cannot. It's up to me to say, I prefer not to use it for myself. And always to understand that Mario, to your point with students, any term you choose highlights some part of your reality and either erases or makes less visible another part. And that's just inevitable. You can't, now people are worried about all of the above, Latine, Latinx, because Latin, of course, that comes from the same thing that Spanish comes from. It comes from that way back when, from the Romans. And you don't want now there's people saying, I don't want to go there. But we are not the only people discussing this. African Americans have struggled over time with terms used by others as slurs, and used what you choose to use for yourself. Have our Native and Indigenous communities have also, for example, we call this America. Well, that's an Italian that was a Castilian, naturalized Castilian, Spain. Americo Vespuccio, who decided somewhere along the way we were America, right? And our indigenous native peoples are like a little uncomfortable with that, more than a little. But what happens, Turtle Island is a beautiful term, but Turtle Island comes from the words from what I've read, from Iroquois, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, but it's only one community. So there's like, well, that's an umbrella term that's better than America for our continent, but it also has its limitations. So what else would we want to say to young people, or to somebody who said, like, everybody should use this term, or this is the only term that's traditional and good and reflects our culture correctly? What could we say, or what would you want to say?
Catalina, I think which is what you said earlier, it's really hard for us to pick a term that's going to identify with everyone, especially when we're speaking of so many people that have very different experiences. And so it really just depends on the individuals and the groups that you're speaking to, and just really getting to know them and asking them, how do you want to be identified as?
Yes, it's about dialogue above all, right? Conversation where you listen to the other person or the other groups of people, and a little bit of, I want to say, humility, in the sense of like, we don't know it all now. We won't know it all ever. And if everybody works with respect and openness, there's possibilities. There's possibilities. Any other thoughts about all of the above?
Yeah, I think I would definitely say as well too, for as you begin to kind of learn who a community is, I think it's taken the opportunity just to kind of engage in the resources that you have around you. I think first off, it's not a formal conversation that has to occur with like, well, what term do you prefer to use? Because sometimes, as we kind of talked about today, some individuals will just identify more with their country of origin. That those are the connections which they have. That's been their experience. They may have the opportunity more so than others to travel back there frequently, and have the experience of being able to kind of engage in two different countries. But I think one of the main things is taking the opportunity to look well, what's around you. What are the opportunities to go to go and eat, to go to an art gallery, to go take a walk around and look at murals as well. And I think that's a really big first step in terms of trying to also kind of see what is it that what are some of the things that are of importance to our different communities here. And I think that's a really, like, that engagement to me is a really important part. There's so many stereotypes, which, and living in the city, you say you live in the city of Chicago, so sometimes individuals outside the city, they'll just take like the snippets which they hear on the news, and then they'll just apply it, to the entire city. And that's, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. But it's the opportunity to be able to get out, the opportunity to be able to engage, to go to the Latino Film Festival once, to go and have dinner, in Pilsen, to go on one of the mural tours or something. And I think it's taking small steps like that as well. And that's an additional part of kind of understanding identity, and also just, opening up this conversation more and more, as we start to engage with different, so different communities can kind of engage on a deeper level.
That's really interesting, because I noticed that in our our Hispanic heritage banner for this particular discussion, which is very common, you'll see the papel picado, which is very Mexican, very, 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 very Mexican, and pretty much, as far as I can tell, only Mexican. So I think also really taking care of saying, okay, like I thought, what could we try? Like maybe flags, or, because I know we have Honduras, we have Puerto Rico. What are we representing here? But also being very careful and just not assuming that a lot of, especially in a land where of those, what was it? I forget how many millions, 62 million, but many millions of 62% are of Mexican background, and not forgetting that the other nearly 40% are not, and being careful, just being very, very careful. If you're coming, and not just if you're coming from the outside as an Anglo, but if you're coming from the outside as, someone of Mexican background, or of Puerto Rican background, or of Colombian, just that, understanding also that what we've all said, your own identity symbols don't translate perfectly again, it's not one story, not Latino representation. It's 1,000 stories that break down stereotypes, that speak for 1,000 experiences. And
if I may say something, Catalina, about that, those diverse stories from our varying cultures in Latin America, there's also a sense of comfort when you do find others that are Latin American in places where you don't expect it, and whether they're Boricuas, Mexicanos, like Argentinos, don't matter. But when you're displaced, or you're in a place where there is another Latino, Hispanic person, and you just lock eyes with that person, it doesn't matter what country they're from, you automatically have this connection with them. And I think that's also a beautiful thing, you know, because as much as we don't, it sounds like we're all saying here we don't like umbrella terms. Sometimes it's okay to get under an umbrella with your paisano when it's raining, you know, and sometimes that paisano is not really your own countryman. It's just another, you know, person that speaks Spanish, and it could be from another country, or and that's kind of cool because you know, I have my best friend is a man who's Mexican descent, Mexican American, and we we call each other carnales, paisanos, brothers, and you know, he's Mexican. I'm from Honduras, and you know, we share culture, we share language, but you know, we often talk about like, hey, how do you say this in Mexico? You know, and we'll say a word, or and I'll say it in Honduras how we refer to it, and we'll laugh about it, or like I'll use a word that Mexicans use, and he loves that, you know, and he'll use words that we use in my culture, and I don't hear that very often because there's not a lot of Hondureños out here, you know, so it's pretty cool to be able to share that too with others, that as different as we are, that commonality is also very comforting in a distant or different place that we're not really from sometimes, you know.
I'm totally stealing that. I'm totally stealing that for the next time I have to talk about this. It's okay to get under the umbrella every now and then, especially when it's raining, right? Come together under the umbrella when it's raining. And I would say that for many people's of all these backgrounds, of all these Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Latine backgrounds, it rains a lot in this country. It rains a lot. And so I love that. I love how you took the umbrella literally and metaphorically all at once. Thank you for that very much. If we
Hi, Catalina. I think now might be a good time to take some questions. And there were a couple in the chat that I know you did touch upon. So if anyone out there does have any more questions, you can put them in the chat or Q&A. But just really briefly, was there any other thoughts about the question about, is there a generational aspect relative to language preference that anyone wanted to add their thoughts to?
Other than say yes. I mean, I think I forget who spoke to that, but it was spoken to, and yes, there absolutely is, because that makes sense. And in fact, what's interesting, one of these articles I read said that younger persons of this background who are growing up, you know, and maybe they're half Salvadoran, half Mexican, or half, you know, Puerto Rican, half Mexican, or Salvadoran, Cuban, Mexican. They already identify primarily as Latino or Latina. That's it. That it doesn't go any further back than that, because when it makes sense, if they themselves are already mixed under the umbrella, so to speak, mixed under the umbrella of love, you know, they already are and they may not speak Spanish, yet they still identify as with the umbrella term. So yeah, there is definitely a generational, and certainly the inclusivity, the use of Latin in Latin America, particularly Latine and hablar con la E is, I mean, children, and there's another generation coming. Like the children there are children that are already growing up with that. The language will change there and here also. Here it'll mix with English, so we'll have a total Creole in about, my prediction, about 50 years, which with elements of both. So yeah, absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I think, and I think you're also seeing it too. If you know, if we're looking at our students and you look at, you know, well, what I do find really interesting is how even if some of our, you know, if our you know, our students of, you know, Mexican, Puerto Rican background, you know, Colombian, Salvador, Honduras, where they may be from. It's really interesting how in the past couple of years, I mean, this has been going on forever. I mean, just depending, you just talk to different generations. But if you look at the connection that they have to music, and how I think music is playing a really, really important role, you know, primarily, you know, with reggaeton and bachata as well. But if you're listening to, and I'll also say I'm just like Mario. I'm in my 40s and as well too. I love reggaeton just like everyone else. I haven't turned my back on it yet and stuff. It's interesting because like now you're starting to see, especially like, I mean, we take a look at I'm just using Bad Bunny for an example. Like the music or not like the music, what I'm noticing lyrically, what's happening is you're starting to see a lot of collaborations which are taking place with Mexican artists as well, from different genres as well too. A lot of experimentation in music, which is opening up doors for a lot of our students in high school, middle school students and everything who are hearing this music, but they're hearing words, they're hearing rhythms, they're hearing things that they've kind of grown up with and are familiar with. And maybe if they can't dominate the language, there's still a connection to it. There's an identity, there's something that they feel, to these artists who now, it's beyond like, oh, that they're just being introduced to the mainstream. They are mainstream, very, 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 very much so. And I think that's playing a huge role in kind of helping our students kind of navigate, or just our young people in general navigate, these questions of identity.
The other thing that I just wanted to add too is just in speaking to the music, and I think Catalina, you can probably speak a little more to this. When you listen to like the lyrics of the music, you can see how like the language, you have Spanish and then you'll have like an English word, and so how the language is just being used in very creative ways. Not only is Spanish being used, but then you have English words just being introduced where there's like no direct translation. So it's just very interesting how just that bilingualism and all, the different cultural pieces that are embedded in that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with the Bad Bunny example. I mean, he did a beautiful collaboration with Natanael Cano, who's from northern Mexico, with corrido tumbado, which is a traditional genre, Mexican genre, but Natanael mixes it up with hip hop and trap, and then with Bad Bunny, it was like fabulous. And then Bad Bunny also did a collaboration with Bomba Estéreo from Colombia. They're like kind of indie pop rock. So yeah, and then what Dr. Pollo was commenting on is absolutely true. There's been a wave of artists that started off often singing in English primarily, and then starting to create versions of their own music in Spanish. And now many just mixing it up at will, when the mood strikes, or it's just not, it's a different phenomenon. The Spanglish, but not Spanglish, even not necessarily mixing the two, sometimes mixing in one word, like not classic Spanglish, but actually just flipping back and forth. It's fascinating. Yes, both of those topics musically are fascinating and have absolutely are forces in the formation of identity, and a formation of, again, a bit of an umbrella identity, because there's the Spanish, there's the English, and there's the different Latino, Latin American countries also coming together. Fascinating. Great music too. Yeah, I don't turn my back on reggaeton. There's some I like more than others, but that's a whole other story.
Okay, if you don't mind, there's one more question. It's a long one, and we did touch, again, on the umbrella terms, but there's some other issues in here. I attended university in the 90s and took a variety of literature that had very prescriptive laws of referring to individuals of Mexican Spanish speaking countries as Chicano, Chicana. What was the evolution of the indoctrination, and where is it today? As an immigrant child of European descent, I could not comprehend the idea that umbrella terms needed to be made, and it mirrored even having my name changed because it was too strange for Americans to learn. Can you speak to the comfort level that we are now in a generation or two later?
Well, I didn't say much about Chicano, Chicanx, by the way. Also, more recent, Chicana, only because it is an activist term that came about in a certain period several decades ago, and very much was sort of an umbrella term but with a Mexican root, with a Mexican and Mexican American activist root, and very present in California in terms of origins, and not as much Not really ever, didn't ever become a an umbrella term, like a pan Latin American umbrella term, in the same way that Hispanic or Latino, Latine, and Latinx did. And it's still used by individuals who want to mark that part of their identity, which is Mexican, Mexican American, and activists. There's a very strong activist sense of the use of that word as an identity term. But that's still in play. And in academia, Chicano authors, chose that as their umbrella term. But it was for that. It's a much more, it's not Pan American or Pan Latin American. And yeah.
If I could comment a little bit of her the second point here about not comprehending umbrella terms because of being a person of European descent. I mean, it is a place where Europe, where often you're identified with your nationality, and that's okay to do in Europe, but once you're here in the States, there's this idea that you have to have an umbrella term for anyone who's not white. And what it makes me sad to see, like families that had to change their names to make it comfortable for other people. But if you look at it in the context of history too, like there's a point in time in history, in different waves of immigration where families, it was beneficial to them economically, socially, to change their names to something that was much more acceptable. And where we are now in regards to the comfort level of our names or how we pronounce things, we are in a different place in time where it's kind of cool to have your ethnic name pronounced properly. And I also know some students and kids that'll say like, man, my name is so boring, because it's like, forgive me for saying this, like it's just a hypothetical, but like it's, John Smith, and like I said, I work at a school that's very, very diverse, and a lot of the kids have very unique names, and to have an Anglo white name, a lot of this, students are like, I wish I had a different kind of name, and it's kind of cool to have a different name, and part of that too is like we live in a culture that for so long we've been okay teaching our kids how to pronounce, Dostoevsky or Tchaikovsky, and that handle is not handle, it's handle, but we can't, teach kids or other people how to say other ethnic names if they're not from Europe. That's a little upsetting to me. So I think it's a matter of not just comfort, but the want to be respectful of others' culture and names.
I should have been Catalina Maria Johansson, by the way. My Swedish grandfather stepped off the boat and went from Johansson to Johnson, which I've always regretted. That's a name. But you're absolutely right about the pronunciation of certain words being correctly pronounced, being valued and admired, and others not. Many times there was an example a while back, I forgot who gave it, about a child that came in speaking Spanish versus a child that came in speaking French. The French is like, ooh la la, oh, Spanish doesn't receive the same kind of admiration. Yeah.
Sometimes even Spanish from Spain receives a different admiration than Spanish from Latin America, and that in itself is a legacy of colonialism and race, So.
Any last minute thoughts? It's probably a good place to stop. Thank you all so much for your time tonight. Did anyone have any last thoughts before we end tonight? This has all been so enlightening, so educational. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the co-panelists for such insightful and really eloquently stated points of view. I've learned so much from each one of you tonight. Thank you.
Yes, me as well. So I will email out, we are recording, we'll have this recording available throughout the end of Hispanic Heritage Month, so October 15th. So I'll email that out when it's available. So thank you all again for attending. Thank you all for taking the time to educate us and enlighten the community tonight. And thank you to the Wheaton League of Women Voters for your partnership on tonight's program and the City of Wheaton Community Relations Commission. So thank you all and have a wonderful night.